Hello, Andrew Dave, the Nonzero Newsletter.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
Okay, how do you like being on this non-zero podcast?
I always love being on the Nonzero podcast. This is Earthling Unplugged, which is a special version of the Nonzero podcast.
Yeah, we keep trying to consolidate our branding and we keep failing. Um, I think there are branding experts who would say just find one word and stick with it.
Right.
Don't throw this Earthling thing in the middle of it. But I really
It,
like the word. I really like the Great Clark, Earthling
mm-hmm.
banner thing, which is I've got the bumper sticker on the back of my car.
Mm. And everyone else can buy that too. I should provide a
Good
link
point.
sometime in the Earthling.
What
We
is
haven't
it?
been doing that.
What is it at cafepress.com?
It is, yeah.
So
I've kind of
you
forgotten
just
the URL, but maybe we can
I
provide a
think
link
I
this week
think
next.
I think it's remarkably like cafepress.com. You can just search for that in non-zero. You probably wind up with a bumper sticker before you knew it.
I think so. Yeah.
Let's see what's going on in the world. Well, how's your life? Is your dog still cowering in the face of bears, or does your dog chase bears or run from them, or what?
She cowers in the face of flies. But
Uh-huh.
she goes after the bears. We had one right outside our backyard last night, and I heard her barking, sounding especially vicious. So I went outside, and sure enough, there was a bear right on the other side of the fence that she was intimidating.
Yeah, well, how does she behave when the bear gets on her side of the fence?
Well, we've seen
Differently?
that she chased a whole family of bears out of our backyard once.
Really?
Yeah.
That's my
Hmm.
kind of dog.
I know. She's great.
When our dog was young, he used to chase squirrels, but he's definitely eligible for Medicare now. So, so we're here to talk partly about the issue of the newsletter that will go to press mere hours after we finish, the Earthling. And it begins with something that's relevant to the news in a somewhat tangential way. The news being that Israel, of course, retaliated against Iran for retaliating against Israel for bombing its consulate. And it was a limited retaliation.
Hmm.
Um, and more importantly, Iran tried to make it sound even more limited than it was, which suggests that Iran would like to just cool things down for a while. And
Yeah, do we know that? Do we? Because I know that the U.S. officials initially or soon after the news broke were saying that a missile hit a military base, and Iranian media has been saying that three small drones, these so-called quadcopters, just these tiny drones with these four
yeah,
rotors, were knocked out of the sky. So they were saying all of the explosions, which I guess were just three, were just air defense systems hitting the drones out of the sky. Do you know if a missile also hit?
I have seen some evidence to the effect that it probably did. And I
Mm,
suspect that Iran, one way I've seen it put is that they're trying to depict it as an internal security problem, saying that the drones were launched from inside Iran. So maybe it's Israeli agents or Israeli proxies, but it wasn't an external military threat because
hmm.
that would make them feel more obliged to retaliate. So they want to depict it. I think Iran is trying to minimize it. I mean, it wasn't that sweeping a retaliation, didn't kill anybody. I did see, for example, that Israel, according to this image on Twitter, I think pretty high credibility, Israel had taken out a radar thing guarding one of Iran's nuclear research facilities or something, which there is certainly in the vicinity of the town that was hit. There is
Hmm.
some nuclear research stuff. And that was described as a shot across the bow, showing Iran they could do it. Also, apparently, there is some evidence elsewhere that there were missiles fired from beyond Iran's borders, possibly from Iranian jets that did not themselves penetrate the borders. So I don't know. I think, but this does look like it will be the end of this particular tit for tat.
Another relevant detail to this situation with the quadcopters is not only that they can't fly from Israel. They don't have the range to do that, which is why you can depict it as an internal
Mm-hmm.
security threat, or maybe they came from Iraq or something. But also, Israel has done this before in the exact same province. Last year, they had a drone attack. They flight some drone sortie in Isfahan province. So it's not an unprecedented thing.
No,
Which
that's
I'll.
right. And
Mhm.
and that's a well, go ahead. Uh,
Well, so that kind of it really makes me think that Iran wants this to kind of be the end. Like they don't want to feel pressure to escalate further. I mean, depending on how you define escalation and de-escalation, I mean, you could see Israel's retaliation, as a de-escalatory move, and it seems like Iran is probably willing to advance that narrative, as you said.
no, I think pretty clearly at this point they want to
Hmm.
advance that narrative, and they don't plan on hitting Israeli soil anytime soon. I mean, as you said, Israel has done the thing that Iran is saying they did this time before with these quadcopters. Apparently, they're actually run by Israeli intelligence,
Hmm.
and they do hit Iranian soil. And this is, a thing that kind of keeps getting missed with, during in the course of all this discussion of the so-called shadow war. It's actually pretty asymmetrical. I mean, um, you know, the Israel has, first of all, been openly striking targets in Syria that sometimes include Iranians. They've killed Iranians on a number of occasions in Syria before. They just haven't killed such high-ranking ones in a consulate. Um, Iran does nothing comparable to that. Israel also stages these attacks on Iranian soil. They've assassinated nuclear scientists. They've done these quadcopter things. Iran apparently doesn't do anything like that inside Israel. So there is that kind of asymmetry. Now, Israel would say, but Iran has these proxies and it supplies them with weapons. And that's why we're doing this. That's one reason we're doing the strikes in Syria. And they attack us. And that's a whole subject you could get into, like how many times Iran has actually asked them to attack Israel. But I would say that as a matter of international law, there's a huge asymmetry because it's not illegal to give weapons to proxy groups. It does it through by and large channels that are fine with it. Iran sends them through Syria, Syrian government's fine with that, and so on. So if you are a stickler for international law, there's a big um, asymmetry there. Uh, and and I guess that's all I have to say. Uh, I would like to complain a little more though about the way people about the blob's handling of this. I actually have part of a podcast I want to play. Do you think it's too early for this? Should I wait for this? I'll wait. I'll wait. We'll do it. We'll do it in the comfort of the overtime segment.
I mean, maybe you could just kind of tease it by saying what that podcast
Oh, it's
is, or
just this like Blob Central. It's actually a podcast put out by the Council on Foreign Relations, which of course is the closest thing there is to a single institutional embodiment of the foreign policy establishment. And it's a podcast that comes out not very often. This one is called The President's Inbox. The
Yeah, I've
host,
heard
I
of that.
think, is James Lindsay, and so to discuss this whole Iran thing, he gets two people together, and I think they both have CFR affiliations. One is this Ray Takai, who just absolutely hates Iran, just hates Iran. He is of Iranian heritage. You get this sometimes. There's a lot of Cuban expats who are part of the Cuba lobby. And then Stephen Cook, who is just kind of a centrist blob Iran hater, just kind of garden variety. And it's just kind of amazing the way he frames the discussion, and that is what I will reveal after I sneeze. See, I knew if I muted my mic, I would not sneeze. That's a good anti-sneeze maneuver. Just mute your mic, and then you will turn out not to sneeze.
I will say about the blob slash mainstream reaction. I know that some people were complaining about how Iran strike last week or attack last week was depicted in the media, and apparently on ABC there were discussions that totally omitted, the context of Israel's strike on the Iranian consulate in Syria. But I thought that the mainstream media was kind of surprisingly reasonable. Like the New York Times and CNN, I read them immediately after the attack, and they were they were both emphasizing that it was intended to minimize casualties and maximize spectacle or maximize drama. Maybe even more than I thought was warranted, because I thought, well, maybe they didn't think it was going air defenses were going to be quite this effective.
Well,
And
I agree, but at the same time, I doubt they were targeting civilians or even people. Now,
mhm.
this is a good example. On this podcast, Ray Takai, I think, says, well, they definitely wanted it to be a mass casualty event. They just failed. I just think that's 100% bullshit. I mean, if you
Yeah.
know anything about Iran, you know they were actually trying to bring this to a close. They felt they had to retaliate. And, you know, in a comparable case with the US and Iraq during the Trump administration, they made a point to hit empty barracks and made sure the barracks would be cleared out before they hit them. And that's just the kind of nonsense you get from people who are actually paid by the Council on Foreign Relations to spew it.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I think the way to put it is they seem to have intended for it to not be a mass casualty event, but there was a risk of casualties, like if the air
There
defense.
absolutely was. Yeah. And I think, and they did want it to be destructive. I'm sure they were disappointed with the amount of physical destruction. Like
Mhm.
they did succeed in doing some damage to an apparently important military facility, but I don't think they took out any jets on the ground or anything. They would have loved to have done a lot of that. And I'm sure they were disappointed at how effective the defenses were. Although there's some disagreement over that. I mean, the 99% number comes from Israeli and American sources, but um, yeah, but for now, I mean, I'm feeling less worried than I was 24 hours ago, and certainly less worried than I was when I saw the first reports on Twitter. One report from a often credible source said that Israel had hit two different nuclear facilities in different places or something.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but last thing I'll say is, Hamas was, saying that some Hamas officials said that the Israeli strike was aggression on the whole region. Iran has to respond, and so on. And Hamas would like this to get ramped up. But I think, as far as the welfare of the people in Gaza go, it's good that it not get ramped up because, for one thing, it steers the world's attention back onto the plight of the people in Gaza. The one qualification I would make is that I did you see these reports like a couple of days ago that the Biden administration, there were two versions of the report. One was that if Bibi would not retaliate, Biden would let him invade Rafah. And the other was that if Bibi would limit the retaliation, Biden would let him attack Rafah in some form. Did you see these
I
reports?
saw the first one of those, or I heard about it, not the second one. Mhm.
Well, if this is a limited retaliation in exchange for which Israel gets the Biden green light on invading Rafah, that would be very bad for the people in Gaza, of course, and we just don't know.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think we could kind of segue into talking about your lead because it is about this general topic, but you were looking more specifically at the British Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister David Cameron, and his recent interview on Sky News.
Yeah, this got a lot of attention. This kind of excerpt. I mean, Glenn Greenwald flagged it, and then it was on some other kind of anti-war podcasts. But basically, it's the Foreign Secretary David Cameron being interviewed on Sky News by this journalist named Kay Burley, and he's going on and on about how the Iranian attack illustrates the true nature of Iran, and she says, well, what would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates? And he kind of, I mean, I transcribed it kind of word for word, and it's, well, we would take the very strong action. And she says, and Iran would say that's what they did. And then he says, well, what they did was a more massive attack, and starts trying to make that distinction. But it was a very effective intervention on her part, and she stuck with it. I mean, the whole thing is good.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that gave me the occasion for a sermon on cognitive empathy and meaning just perspective taking, just trying to understand the perspective of your enemies. Because there had been, and this was one of the New York Times pieces that maybe you were lauding as kind of, pretty even-handed. But there was a New York Times piece that reported that Israeli officials said that they didn't bother to give, and this is news, by the way. I was unclear on the extent to which, if any, the U.S. had been given a heads up about the consulate strike. The word is Israel just seconds before it happened said, okay, something big is going to happen or something like that. They did not consult with the U.S., according to this report. And what the officials told the Times is that they didn't consult with the U.S. because they thought that, quote, Iran would not react strongly. Well, obviously not an effective exercise of cognitive empathy, if it's true that they really, didn't anticipate this, as opposed to the possibility that they just realize that forgiveness is easier to get than permission, which may be the case. But the Times also reports, by the way, that U.S. officials were very angry about the failure to get the green light and so on. So anyway, the apparent failure of Israel to effectively exercise cognitive empathy, provided with this Kay Burley intervention where she just does this, asks him to do this simple exercise that we've all heard about. Try to put yourself in their shoes if you're in comparable circumstances. And she really threw him for a loop just by, asking him to do this thing we've all been told to do. So I get into not just cognitive empathy, but why it's hard with enemies, especially. And one reason it is hard is because of this thing called attribution error. I won't get into that at length here, but one of its consequences is that when our enemies do something bad, or our friends do something good, or we do something good, we're inclined to attribute it to disposition, to the way the kind of person they are. So when Cameron said this dastardly attack reveals the, quote, true nature of Iran, that's like classic, attribution error, as if there were no circumstances that led them to do it, as if there were no elites in Iran insisting that they do it, as if their proxies weren't insisting that they do it, and so on, as if there was no circumstantial stuff going on. So that's classic attribution error, and the corrective for attribution error is effective cognitive empathy. And one of the interventions that can lead to that is exactly what she did, just the old put yourself in the shoes exercise. So I go on about that a bit, and I do think, like, and ultimately my point is not about this particular conflict. It's like we need journalists and others, including ourselves, to just do this, to just go around doing it, saying, put yourself in your enemy's shoes, or saying to ourselves, painful as it is, try to put yourself in your own enemy's shoes. Not because, they deserve sympathy or anything, but just because you'll be more clear-eyed about dealing with them, because you will have better insight into their actual motivations for doing things.
Right.
Which should benefit you in principle.
Yeah, the interview is quite effective. I mean, the whole 9-minute interview needs to be watched to be fully appreciated, because the way she's sequencing her questions kind of produces the effect where he's sort of caught in a bind, because he's just talked about, what Britain would do, what he would advocate that Britain would do if its embassy was flattened, as she said.
Yeah.
And then that's when she springs their question on him. And yeah, I thought it was interesting. We were kind of talking about it. British journalists tend to be a little less deferential to powerful people than an American ones, which is surprising. Like in this case, David Cameron is literally a lord. Like from her perspective, she has to call him like Lord Cameron.
She called him my lord. It was kind of a joke, but she said, "Oh, you've become a lord since we last met. Good to speak to you, my lord."
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a joke, and then it's also kind of not a joke. Like it's still a class society in a way that America is not. And yet the trappings of kind of the imperial presidency are sort of more profound in America, I think, when you see journalists interviewing the president.
Or almost anyone. I mean, there's a thing that you more often hear British journalists do than American journalists, although you do hear Matt Lee the Associated Press correspondent do it in press conferences sometimes. And it's just to say, when you ask them a question and they start out with some speech, you just say right away, that's not the question that you're not answering the question I asked. You hear that more often from British journalists.
And she had to do that in this case too.
Yeah.
When she was asking him, I think she was asking him about the wisdom of Israel's strike and what he thought about whether it was sound decision making to strike that embassy. And he started to say, well, that's the thing that the Israelis decided to do. And she had to kind of interrupt him.
And I certainly understand they're so on. And she's like, shut up and answer the question.
I wanted to ask, do you think David Cameron, is this seeming lack of cognitive empathy more a feature of like the behind the scenes decision making, like all the important people, British decision makers, state planners are thinking about Iran and they really don't understand its motivations, or is it more a feature of propaganda, or
well,
maybe both?
It is. With a politician, it's hard to say when they're speaking in public. And the funny thing is, that's why her intervention was so effective, because when she says to the foreign secretary, what would you do if a hostile country flattened our consulate? There's only one thing he can say.
Right.
We'd blow them away. You can't be a successful politician and not say something like that. And so yeah, no, it's true. And that's and it's hard to say because they're politicians and they're going to say the things you'd predict, but some politicians really feel these things. And I mean, what are some, well, for example, probably Tom Cotton, right?
Yeah.
I think he feels in his heart that Iran is the incarnation of evil. And a number of these people, Marco Rubio, that could be a much more calculated thing. It's hard to say. And
what do you think about Trump? What about Trump? I mean, because this might apply to all politicians. That could be a separate question, but I do think on some level they have to be capable of cognitive empathy to become so powerful, because you have to do a lot of maneuvering and negotiating. In some parts of your career, you're doing some ass kissing. Other parts, you're like exerting leverage and power. That all requires cognitive empathy. But for Trump in particular, who, he's the author of The Art of the Deal. He had a successful business career. And also, he seems a little more interesting on some of these things.
Can we just put a little asterisk on that? It has been established that had he taken the $20 million his father gave him and just put it in an index fund, he'd be a lot richer than he is now.
Oh, really? I would have not guessed that. I mean, he's got his name
power of
on
compounding. I mean, the stock market is what does he average? 8% a year or something? $20 million like decades ago? Come on. He'd be like Elon Musk.
Interesting. But, it must take a kind of business savvy or some sort of savvy to have your name on like the best skyscrapers in all of these different cities.
Oh, yeah. He's got something. And I hope the 20 million number is right. It's probably wrong, and I'm wrong about all of this. But, yeah, I mean, see, the thing about Trump is, I think his enmities are so much about himself that probably all the stuff about America's enemies is just like meta, it's just like whatever works, I and in a way, I think that's potentially a virtue of his. I actually think he has more capacity than some politicians to look at international affairs with detachment, which is kind of the opposite of the way he looks at his own. I mean, when somebody disrespects him or whatever, although even that is hard to say. I mean,
I think that's right. I mean, when Tucker Carlson's text messages were leaked and he's like calling Trump an asshole and saying, I hate that guy, I can't stand him. A few months later, Trump is on his show, he's kind of maintained the alliance between them. It's sort of water under the bridge.
Yeah. I think actually Elon Musk is more kind of viscerally driven in his personal relations. I mean, he sustains hostility well beyond a point where it seems useful.
I was surprised to see on X that he came out against the TikTok ban, and he noted that it would probably be good for X because it's a rival social media.
Well, remember,
rival.
Tesla makes him want to stay in the good graces of the Chinese government.
Okay, so there's a cynical aspect to it.
Oh, I would never introduce cynical considerations to any conversation, but
I mean, cynical
uh,
on his part in the sense of like naked self-interest.
well,
Um,
it's speculation, but you know,
and
Tesla's hurting, man.
speaking of which, I mean, maybe that's the other news thing we could talk about before really getting into the other Earthling items, because it looks like they're going to now be voting on these foreign funding bills, Ukraine, Israel,
Hmm.
Taiwan. I don't understand the whole procedural thing. Apparently, the Democrats bailed out the House Speaker, the Republican House Speaker, in some way by allowing this to come to the floor vote. Usually that would just involve Republicans voting. But in any case, it seems like tomorrow they're going to vote on these as separate kind of
Hmm.
amendments, and then they'll be packaged if they pass and go to the Senate. But then there's also a fourth bill that involves this TikTok ban, and I think seizing Russian assets is also part of that fourth bill. And then some more sanctions, of course, because you always have to throw in some sanctions on the litany of enemies. Do you want to talk about any of these funding issues?
Yeah, I mean, I just have mainly questions. So yeah, Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, did a 180 some time ago, some days ago, and decided he was going to support funding for Ukraine. And people have been trying to figure out why. I just heard Bill Scher and Matt Lewis on the DMZ podcast being actually not very cynical about it at all and saying, well, in his heart, he's a Reagan Republican. And, when the chips are down, your heart comes out. Kind of, I mean, it wasn't quite that Hallmark Cardish, but I was kind of surprised at the lack of, there must be some political calculation that could conceivably explain what he's doing. And the question I have is, I mean, it's true that apparently the intelligence agencies gave him a briefing and they're capable of, they can show you shit they can like flatter you that they're showing you this stuff nobody knows about and be very selective about it. Um, but what I wondered is whether Trump hasn't said to him, look, I want to be on record as against Ukraine funding, but I'd actually rather it go through because it seems to me that that's what makes sense for Trump, right? If if the funding is held up and the Russians just roll over Ukraine, that's not good for Trump, I don't think. And
Uh,
and
Well, he did
whereas
do
if
that. I mean, there's been reporting on that, and that Mike Johnson went and met with Trump, and even David Cameron in a separate interview was talking about how he went and talked to Trump, and was pleased at the progress being made and how Trump is thinking about Ukraine funding. I mean, they're trying to bill it as, oh, well, we'll do some of it as a loan to make it
Mhm.
less of a poison pill for some of the MAGA crowd who doesn't want Ukraine funding. It's total bullshit. I mean, it's like a zero interest loan that the president can cancel. Like they don't have to pay back. But anyway, they want to frame it like that, and that apparently comes from Trump's camp or from his meeting with Mike Johnson. So I think
Has
you're
that
right.
well, you mean Mike Johnson emerged from the meeting and then proposed something like this, or has it been reported that Trump really wants the funding to go through? Has that been reported?
I can't say I haven't read such a report, but that's what Mike Johnson himself is saying. He's saying Trump is 100% with me on this.
On the Ukraine funding?
Yeah.
Huh. Well, because I knew Trump had spoken favorably of Johnson, like he was giving Johnson political cover in a generic way.
Right.
And I knew that. But then I don't understand why Matt and Bill were, you know, kind of had to resort to an actually inspiring explanation. I mean, it just seems to me like Trump, the best case for him is he opposes the funding, but it goes through because almost certainly Ukraine's going to be a mess in November. But
Mhm.
now it doesn't have to be. If Biden were the kind of president who knows how to use leverage, they might wind up with a peace deal. But he doesn't seem to be good at using leverage with Ukraine or Israel. Um, and so for Trump, it's all good. The amount of money he can complain about our having wasted on a war that's just, a stalemate only goes up. And
Mhm.
he doesn't get blamed for Russia rolling over Ukraine, which might happen if the funding doesn't come through. So I don't, I don't understand the mystery. I mean, of course, the House Speaker is going to pay attention to Trump's political interests. Of course.
Right. Yeah, I think Trump's a big part of this. I just looked it up. I think the 100% line pertained more to Trump being supportive of him maintaining his speakership
as
because
speaker, right?
right, because there's been this MAGA crowd wants to again vacate the speaker, or however they phrase it, because he is doing what they got rid of the last guy for doing or wanting to do. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think what you're saying about Trump is true, both that his influence here, and also his political calculus, because it would be bad for him if Russia just rolled through. But I don't know if this Ukraine funding is going to substantially change the facts on the ground in Ukraine.
I gotta think it's gonna help. I mean, it sounds like the ratio of ammo at the disposal of the two sides has gotten pretty extreme. I mean, maybe these are like propaganda numbers, but I'm hearing like on artillery shells like 9-1 and stuff as of a couple of weeks ago.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly Russia is gaining ground, not at a breathtaking pace, but breakthroughs happen, and
Hmm.
they may not happen as much in the age of drones. I don't know. The last time a big one happened was before drones were such a big part of the terrain there. But I don't know. The other thing is the Democrats may have given Johnson assurance that they'll give him cover and keep him as speaker, which I think it's within their power to do if it comes to a vote.
Yeah, I think so too. Maybe we can actually go to the overtime and go on the other side of the paywall and continue talking about Russia, Ukraine, because we have an
Okay.
item on this foreign affairs piece looking at the peace talks early in the war that ended up failing, but looked promising for a while. We're also going to talk about the Stephen Walt piece and foreign policy, this Microsoft deal with G42, which is this big AI
This is
company in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think this is a bit. It's a new step in the Cold Warization of the technology landscape. It's starting to feel like the 1950s, where Microsoft salutes and says, "You just tell us what to do, President Biden." We'll get into that. The and yeah, the Wall piece about whether pro-Israel people are anti-Israel. I wrote that piece, by the way, not that piece, but I wrote a piece for the New York Times like 14 years ago, 15 years ago, called the title was Against Pro-Israel, but pro-Israel was in quotes.
Mm,
I was saying
hmm,
the term is ironic because the pro-Israel people are actually bad for Israel. But
interesting.
I
I've heard
digress. Got me
interesting.
into some trouble.
Oh yeah. So yeah,
So
if
what
people want to
else?
get past the over or get into overtime, you just go to Nonzero on Substack and become an NZN member. Then you'll get all of the audio content.
And you'll get to hear me do a rant about this segment of the podcast I'm going to play.
Sweet.
It's gonna be highly animated. In fact, if I don't sound that way now, it's because I'm saving up my energy for the rant. It's going to be very powerful. Um, and yeah, so the thing is, you become a paid subscriber to the Nonzero Newsletter, should you be so inclined, and then you go to the post for this podcast, and you can listen to the overtime part right away. But also there, you can find a way to set up your feed so that you get access to all the overtimes, and that includes, by the way, early access to the Anatoly Karlin podcast
Hmm.
and enduring access to the overtime part of that. And there's two kinds of people in the world: the kind who know who Anatoly Karlin is, and the kind who don't. And the kind who do are already, they're running for their credit card.
Right, where they
It's
should
wild,
be.
wild. Okay. Oh wait, yeah, that'll be posted by the time this goes up, right? Yeah, it'll have to be.
Yeah. Well, the
Yeah,
early access is already. Hmm.
that's right. Okay, so we're going into overtime now. Is that the plan?
Hmm. Yep.
All right, here we go.
This was a free preview of Earthling Unplugged. To unlock the rest of this conversation and other exclusive audio content, become an NZN member at nonzero.substack.com.